So we can start this. This is the third seminar of the Pi seminars series that we're organizing here at DISY, the DISY department. In this seminar, we will have our as guest Manuel Mazo Jr. He's an associate professor from the Technical University of Delft in the Netherlands, and before that he was a postdoc at the University of Groningen, also in the Netherlands, jointly with a research institute called INCAS3 from the Netherlands. He also got a number of fellowships, and most important is the recipient of an ERC starting grant in 2017. And today in this talk he will tell us a bit about the history of this starting grant, so the ideas behind that, how he came up with this idea, and hopefully also will share with us some of the most interesting results that he got so far. Okay, Manuel, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction, Giovanni. So I said, like, I'm gonna focus and given the heterogeneous audience, I'll try to not delve too much into the math and stick to the more general ideas. And I'll try to give you an overview of how I arrived to the idea that eventually was granted with an ERC grant. And the title of the talk is Interdisciplinary Approaches to Scheduling of Event-Trigger Network Control Systems. That's not the title of my ERC, but it remarks the nature of the core idea that underlies my ERC. Go to the right. Yeah. So I'll start basically focusing on the genesis of the idea, and to arrive to the idea that I propose for my ERC grant, I'll need to talk about two seemingly disconnected topics. One is network control systems. The other one is symbolic control methods. And I'll try to give you at least a hint of, or a flavor of, what these two areas of research entail. And then I'll get to the spark, what I call the spark for part 3, which is, again, like a historical story of how I started being bothered about a problem that eventually became this ERC grant project. Then I'll state the problem. What's this problem of scheduling event trigger controllers? And then I'll start developing a little bit about the solutions. And finally, I'll give you some hints on the things that we are doing most recently, problems that we're encountering, what are the future venues of research that we see ahead of us. And I included, just given the topic of the seminar series, I included some slides on tips and tricks when you're writing grants, particularly if you're focusing on ERC, the kind of things that I've learned through multiple workshops and seen multiple ERC project proposals, some which got granted and some that didn't. So hopefully I have some useful tips for people that are planning to write an ERC, at least a starting grant. So let me start with the genesis of the idea. And I said, first, I want to give you a very quick overview of my background. Giovanni already touched on some of these things. Maybe what I want to remark is that my bachelor's and master's, so I have a telecommunications engineering degree from Spain. That means that my original background is actually on communications. It's not even on control. During my master's, or my first double degree in Sweden at KTH, that's when I started really specializing a bit on robotics and automation and control. And during my PhD, while it was focused on control, I started diverting a bit into applied math, which is very much connected to control, but also had a very large component of computer science, and in particular theoretical computer science. And hopefully towards the end of the talk, you'll see how all these pieces kind of came together. And just to also, give a hint that you don't necessarily need to be a stellar by the book researcher to get an ERC grant. I also added here in this slide that I also started my PhD, or some of my PhDs, in Spain and Australia, and I jumped a bunch of times until I really found the place where I felt at ease, and I really felt that this is what I want to do. So I also am not like by no means the standard path researcher, and I guess that's also what sometimes makes you successful. So let me start with this historic overview with the topic of my PhD. So my PhD contained essentially 2 chapters, and I like to think that it was a bit of a schizophrenic PhD thesis. It had a part 1 that was talking about network control systems, and in particular about distributed event trigger control. And I'll try to explain in a few slides what is this all about. And the second part that was talking about symbolic control methods. And symbolic control methods is where this theoretical computer science component comes into play. There, basically, I was looking into methodologies to automatically synthesize controllers, which include some temporal logics and also some quantitative parts to it. So that's where these mixed qualitative and quantitative specifications come into play. Now, while I was finalizing my PhD thesis, I always wanted to have a 3rd chapter, and this is the 3rd part that I mentioned in the outline. I wanted to have something along the lines of automatic synthesis of event trigger controllers, something that it will put together part 2 and part 1 in a neat way. And I did some attempts, but I never really managed to get something that I was satisfied with and that it will make it into the thesis. So that never really happened. But you will see how somewhat that eventually has happened. So let me start with part 1 and this story about network control systems. So in a nutshell, the starting point is the following. When you study control theory, you usually look at differential equations, so things like x dot equals to f of xu, and then you design some function k of x that you plug into u, so that this new differential equation x dot equals to f of x comma kx satisfies some properties. So for instance, the origin is asymptotically stable. Now, in reality, when you look at how we implement these controllers nowadays, with some rare exceptions where you implement this really in an analog fashion, normally what you do is you have some computer that is computing this k of x function. So you're taking a measurement, you compute k of x, you inject it into the system that you're controlling and repeat this cycle. Now, as said, like we design things with pen and paper in this form, but then we implement it in the form of the left. And the question is, how do you know that when you're implementing things, you're retaining the properties of what you did with pen and paper? So how do you know that the math still carries through to the actual implementation? Now, the underlying assumption is that you say, well, if you run this cycle fast enough, then things should work out. And in practice, actually, what you usually do is you just do not only fast enough, you do things periodically so that you can do at least some level of analysis that things will work out. Now, when you start looking at the network controllers or situations when you have limitations of bandwidth or computation, you will like to relax this assumption of running this cycle very fast and periodically. And the solution that people started looking into is, well, what if we do things aperiodically? What if we aperiodically take samples, compute, and inject into the plan? Could we in that way reduce the energy and bandwidth consumption of this particular control loop? And the idea that some of us started exploring is this idea of introducing feedback from the plant into the process of sampling the system. And that's what it's called event-based or event trigger control. And the idea is that you look at your sensors nowadays could be smart enough to decide, well, this new piece of this new sample that I acquired is worth really sending to the controller to recompute the control action, or maybe it's not adding much information, therefore I just wait until I get some significant change on the behavior of my system so that I send this sample. Now, getting a little bit more mathematical, traditionally we're implementing controllers in a sample and hold fashion. So that is, we will have something, the control signal will look like this staircase sort of thing, where like every time you get a new sample, say at time t1, then the control is recomputed and it's hold constant until you take a new sample at, say, time t2. Now you can think of it as basically you have your signal coming out of the system, so measured by the sensors, and you have a switch that from time to time is going to be closed. So when I close it, that means that a new sample is provided to the controller computes the control action and is applied to the system again. And that's why this takes this sort of staircase shape. Now, alternatively, you could think that, well, let me replace this switch by something that looks like the following. I'm going to replace the switch by saying I have some error signal that is representing the difference between the last sample that the controller has that used to compute the control action and the current measurement that I'm taking from my plant. Now, naturally, that error signal in this picture here on the right is this red line. Whenever you take a new sample, whenever you send a new sample to the controller, whenever you close this switch, will be reset to 0, right? Because then psi of t will be equal to psi of tk. Now, doing some mathematical analysis, and there's certain assumptions on the plant and the controller that you design on pen and paper, you can show that if you guarantee that the ratio between the norm of that error signal and the norm of the state of the plant is below some constant, then you'll get asymptotic stability, so that you retain the property that you designed your controller for. So that means that basically graphically, if I represent this blue function that I call phi by this blue line, and the red line is the sigma constant, then what happens is that in this control system, for instance, at the beginning, you see how this signal grows very fast. That means that I'm hitting the red line very quickly. Then I'm taking a new sample, I'm closing my switch, and then it goes to 0 and again. And as soon as my system starts becoming more stable or closer to stability, then you can see how the time between closing the switch starts expanding. Now, what's the benefit of doing this is that now compared to a periodic sort of paradigm where you probably will have to be transmitting very fast to make sure that in every circumstance you retain stability properties, now towards the end, you're saving a lot of communications or computation, if you wish. Now, that's in a nutshell the idea that underlies event trigger control. And that's this part 1 of my thesis, was basically dwelling on how to do this when you have a distributed communication system, and I'll touch a little bit on it in a few slides. Now, let me move on to part 2, which was this idea of symbolic methods for control. So the idea of symbolic methods in control comes from the verification of the area of verification of computing systems, actually, and actually the next step to it, which is the verification of cyber-physical systems. There, what you want to do is you want to verify that a certain property of a cyber-physical system holds. And because analyzing a cyber-physical system means analyzing a hybrid system, something where you will have some continuous dynamics interacting with some discrete model representing hardware and software. You have these hybrid dynamics that may be really hard to analyze formally. And therefore, one approach that people follow is inspired on work from computer science, is to apply an abstraction step in which you throw away some fine detail information from the hybrid dynamics, so in favor of reducing your dynamics to something of the form of a finite state machine. Then once you have a finite state machine, you can leverage all the tools from computer science developed for formal verification, model checking, theorem provers, and whatnot, to verify whatever property you want to verify. And if you did this abstraction in the right way, then the verification at this level up here will carry through to the concrete system that you wanted to verify. Let me see, maybe I stop to answer the question that I see now. What are the assumptions on the dynamics of the system, slide 8, to guarantee sort of stability? Yeah, I was skipping the details. Basically, what you assume, what I'm assuming in this slide in particular is that the closed loop, the analog closed loop, so when you implement this in continuous time with this controller and these dynamics, you get input to state stability with respect to measurement errors, which is a rather technical assumption, which is satisfied for linear systems as long as your controller is rendering the system asymptotically stable, so that your closed loop matrix is Hurwitz. That's satisfied, but this can be relaxed in many different ways. So there's a million papers on event trigger control relaxing these assumptions in different directions. Okay, let me then go back to where I was. So essentially, for verification, this is a typical procedure that people follow, both people coming from the computer science world, where they start looking maybe at models like time automata with very simple continuous dynamics, but also from the control side, where we look at models with more complex continuous dynamics and maybe simpler discrete dynamics. And there's a rich literature on how to construct these discrete abstractions, because once you have constructed your discrete abstraction in a formal way, up here you're essentially leveraging tools that exist already for a couple of decades. Now, the next step will be using these same sort of ideas of abstracting systems to synthesize controllers. So the previous slide is talking about verifying properties. You get a system that you can attach. It's already completely designed and you want to verify something. But you could also follow a similar procedure to synthesize controllers. Imagine I give you some very complex continuous dynamical system, and you need to synthesize for a very strange property that involves reactivity, some safety properties, reachability, maybe even some temporal logic formula, and you want to synthesize a controller for that system. So what you could do is, again, abstract this system into a discrete abstraction. Maybe once you have this discrete abstraction, you can compose that with some model of hardware and software, maybe even some model of some protocol, something that is constraining what your system can actually do in a discrete fashion. And then once you're here, you could actually synthesize a controller that will be discrete, so that this model with the controller satisfies some desired property. And again, there's quite a rich literature on that, also dating back a few decades, both coming from the world of discrete event systems in control, and also on computer science in the area of synthesis for temporal logics in general. Now, the next step is, well, okay, now you have synthesized a discrete controller. If you did the abstraction properly, you can also refine this controller and construct what will look like a hybrid controller, such that this continuous dynamics with this hybrid controller satisfies the property that you were going after. Now, again, when I was doing my PhD, there was a boom on both the event trigger control was almost basically in its infancy. This area of synthesis, correct by design synthesis of controllers was also booming, and there was quite a lot of, at least the basic layer of the methodologies were set up at that point. And in that sense, I was just contributing to expand on what was happening in both these two sides of the world. Now, here I show one way. This is, I can skip this. This is basically an alternative way in which you just directly abstract the hybrid dynamics, but the story is essentially the same. Now, let me get to the desired part 3 and how things started for me, how the path started towards my ERC idea. So I was saying, people were, including myself, we were arguing, if you abandon the periodic execution paradigm, you may be able to reduce computation and communication. And the idea is that I hope that I convince you a little bit that you can reduce the amount of transmissions if you're in a network system, because your sensors are paying attention to, is this valuable information or not to be sent through the network. Now, then the argument was, if you're reducing the amount of packets that you throw into your channel, then you're saving bandwidth. And there was even an argument that I was making, and with me, many other researchers, is that, well, and if you're in a wireless communication system, because you're transmitting less, you're also reducing energy consumption. And therefore, if you have a wireless network control system, maybe you may be able to expand the life of this control system, because your network now will save some energy and may be able to sustain operations for a bit longer. Now, these slides, I think I actually use them in my PhD defense, and I'll show you what happened then. So I was looking into how to use this in a distributed setting in which now you don't have access to the whole state of the system. So I have some sort of protocol and some modified triggering conditions that will allow me to implement this event trigger mechanism in a distributed way. And the idea was as follows. This green box is a controller, centralized place where you compute the control actions. The blue nodes will be sensors and the red ones will be actuators. So I had some triggering conditions that were running with only local information at the blue nodes. And say node 3 now said, well, I detect an event that means that now I want to transmit information. So this node will notify the controller. And the idea is that then the controller will request measurements from all the sensors, so they will have a synchronized snapshot of what's happening with the plant at that moment, so that you can compute a proper control action. Then after receiving that notification, all the sensors will send these measurements, and then the control action will be computed and sent to the actuators, together with some additional information to the sensors for other purposes. Now, yeah, maybe, I don't know if it will work out, but I kind of showed already a snapshot, but does anybody see a problem with this scheme and the argument that I was making in terms of saving energy? And feel free to open your microphone. Gianpietro cannot answer because he knows the answer, and Amy also, and Matteo also. So, well, okay, I'll give it away. No. So I see Alessandro providing some answer. It's not that sensors don't contain new information, because indeed that could be a problem of inefficiency in terms of transmissions that may not really be needed. But we were actually solving that by using this theta here, and I don't want to get into that. The problem is somewhat more fundamental. There's this phase in the protocol in which I was requesting measurements from everybody. And even more fundamental than that, if, say, node 2 needs to be able to relay an event generated by node 3, that means implicitly that everybody needs to be listening all the time, right? I mean, you could say, well, okay, we could do some sort of cycling where like they don't only listen for one time slot every 10, you can incorporate that into analysis, but essentially you're basically periodically listening. So all my promises that, because I transmit in an aperiodic way, you're saving a lot of energy, they may be gone. And as a matter of fact, this is what somebody pointed at me during my PhD defense, which you can imagine that this is like the worst thing you want to hear during your PhD defense, somebody telling you your assumptions are wrong. And my assumption, mine and many other people's assumption from the control side, being ignorant, even myself being a telecommunications engineer, I had forgotten listening costs energy. And as a matter of fact, at least for multiple different devices, it costs more energy than transmitting, because you need to have an amplifier open for a longer time than when you're transmitting. When you transmit, you just amplify your signal for a little time that you're transmitting, while when you're listening, you need to start amplifying a little bit before and a little bit after to make sure that you don't miss anything. So basically what this professor during my PhD defense pointed out was a very smart guy working on wireless sensor networks. He said, like, yeah, reducing transmissions is not going to be enough. You need to reduce listening times. And that's basically where this quest started for me. Like, how do I address this problem? Now, there's a bunch of different solutions that I've been exploring over the years. So one is using self-trigger control, which we have been actually implementing and demonstrating with Gianpietro, Amy, and his group. You can also do decentralized event trigger control with asynchronous updates, which sounds very technical, but basically there you update the controller with only measurements from one sensor, the one that really has new information, following a little bit the reasoning of Alessandro in the chat. You could use smarter radio protocols, and that's where exactly GP and Amy and their group contributes drastically. And you can make protocols that are smarter in how they use the radio waves so that they don't use so much energy for listening, and that you're much more efficient with how you transmit things. And you can combine all these things. But there's a fourth point that is where my idea for my ERC started, is you can do scheduling in a smart way. And let me get into that. What is the essence of the problem that I encounter, or the problem that this professor pointed at me, is that when you're doing network control, you have a sort of de facto separation of concerns. You have on the one hand the guy that is designing the controller, and on the other side of this wall in this slide, you have the guy that is doing the scheduling, the one that makes sure that packets are transmitted at the right time, that no two packets from different control loops collide with each other, or that the wireless radios are open at the right moment. Now, when you have this separation of concerns, you need to have some way of communicating across this wall. And what is that thing that you need to communicate across this wall? Is some sort of model that lets the guy doing the scheduling predict or decide when he needs to make sure that a packet arrives on the other side, or when the radios need to be switched on to listen for possible communications. So that's basically the core problem, is that you need to have such models so that you have a smart scheduling that can reduce listening times, but also avoid collisions. And in that way, you can use in a smart way your bandwidth. Because I illustrated the problem with the listening times, but if you think about saving bandwidth, what is the use of knowing that you're not going to be transmitting as much as you will be doing in a periodic fashion when you don't know when those transmissions will happen? Essentially, you're basically saying, hey, I'm not going to be transmitting every 3 samples, but you need to save for me 1 slot every 3 samples, just because I may be transmitting. So then, you're saving bandwidth, but if you're in a real-time context, you're not really saving it, because you're still allocating it in a preemptive way. Now, the second part is not just these models are not going to be able only to allow you to do smart scheduling, they will also allow you to do smarter analysis and design when it comes to the control side. So one open question on event trigger control has been for a long time, and to a certain extent, even today, even though we are providing partial answers, is if I give you 2 different event trigger designs, so you can think of that sigma red line that I gave you in that description of event trigger control, how do you know which of the 2 event trigger controllers are going to perform better? So let's pick as a metric on average, which of the 2 are going to transmit on average less? That's not an easy answer, an easy question to answer. And if you could have some sort of predictive models of how this communication or this generation of events is going to look like, you have some hope now. You will have some model that you could analyze and probably provide answers to that question. And as a matter of fact, that's something that we have been doing quite recently. Simultaneously, I will argue that the event-triggered control approach is a sort of greedy approach. You're basically looking at the current piece of data and saying, I'm not going to transmit it now because I can wait a bit longer. So every time you're trying to be greedy and waiting as much as possible to transmit, but maybe it will be smarter to transmit now a bit earlier so that later you can transmit in a more sparse way. And that's, again, something I have a slide where I will show you that that's indeed the case, but how do you know when should you transmit a little bit earlier to gain something in the future if you don't have a model of how these events are gonna be happening in the future? Okay, so I hope that at least the essence of what the problem is more or less clear, and at least I hope that I have convinced you that the scheduling of event trigger controls systems is an interesting problem that deserves some attention. Are there any questions that I need to clarify at this stage? Because what will come now is going to get a little bit more technical, but it's just basically building on top of this story. No?
Manuel, sorry,
Yeah.
I have one question about the abstraction step that you were mentioning before. You said a couple of times that something like if you do the abstraction properly, when you switch from the continuous to the discrete domain. So what does that exactly mean?
Yeah, so that means you need to define, essentially, you need to have a way of comparing the behavior, so the trajectories that your continuous model will generate versus your discrete model. And that boils down to the following. So if you have a continuous differential equation, your trajectories are going to be continuous trajectories in time.
Mm-hmm.
But let's say that you only care about what happens at the sampling instance in time, right? Okay. Now you have the next problem is that your discrete model, that's going to be evolving every arrow, let's say, that you take. That's a movement of one sampling time. But you have a finite number of states, while the domain of your signal is a continuum, right? Mm-hmm. Now, you want to make sure that if I look at the trajectory generated from this abstract system, the discrete one, the outputs that is generating at the sampling times are always some epsilon predefined away from what the continuous system will actually generate. So that you can say that this discrete model is really approximating with a certain precision at all times for all possible trajectories, the original continuous system.
Okay, I see. But do you have to predefine the number of states or in the discrete system?
No, so actually, usually what you do is you predefine. I'll touch on that in a very specific context in a bit. But you normally what you predefine is the precision that you want to achieve.
Okay.
You want to make sure that the trajectories that your discrete model generate are always epsilon away from the ones of the continuous one, and from that you get the way in which you will partition your system and how you will construct this abstraction. And usually you can imagine that these techniques do not scale very well, right? Because they're based on gridding in a smart way, essentially. Mm-hmm. Hopefully, some of it will become at least a little bit more grounded when I talk about the next step. Yeah?
Thank you. Yeah.
Cool. Then, so basically, if you think now about why people have been traditionally using periodic sampling, is because then the model that you transmit from the control guy to the scheduling guy is just a period plus a deadline, right? So it's just a very simple model. So every 3 seconds, you need to schedule a slot for me, right? Now, you could do things a bit more complex and say, no, I'm going to give you a sequence beforehand. And that's possible when you do something, what we call self-trigger control, when like once from a given sample, you can compute, well, the next transmissions are going to be at time 1, 2, and 3. Then you can tell the guy, okay, reserve for me those slots. But when you're doing event trigger control, this is happening on the fly. So it's a bit harder to figure out, well, what exactly do I need to pass on to the guy on the other side? Now, I'm a controls guy. So to me, scheduling is essentially yet another controls problem. And let me give you the problem statement from the perspective of a controls guy. So now my control problem is the following. I have 2 control loops, which may share some controller, and they share a communications bus. What I need to make sure is that I schedule when they get access to the channel so that the safety property is not violated. And the safety property is basically, I want to make sure that no 2 control loops try to access the communication channel at the same time. So maybe a bit more clearly, the problem statement will be, how can you schedule medium access of a periodic event trigger controllers to, one, reduce energy in wireless systems by reducing listening times, and the other objective will be to incorporate multiple aperiodic real-time systems in a channel. And that was essentially the problem statement that appears in my ERC. That's what I want to achieve. This is what nobody has been looking at. This is what I wanted to figure out. How can you do that? I'm gonna skip this one because it's essentially what I just said. Now, this is going back to the question from Giovanni. So the first step that you need is some sort of mathematical object that will allow you to compare trajectories of two seemingly different classes of systems. And fortunately for me, this is something that people have been looking in the literature of abstractions. So you need to be able to compare differential equations with finite state machines. Now, what you need is then some notion of system that can encapsulate both classes of systems. And that's what we call a generalized transition system, or there's many different names that people give. But basically, I'm not going to get into too many details, just enough so that you understand what are the objects that I try to construct so that I can answer the problem that I just stated. So I'm going to say a system, to define any system, you need to define a sextuple of these following elements. You need to define what is the set of states. So if it's a finite state machine, that will be a finite set, the A, B, C, D, E. If it's a control system, then it may be Rn, the Euclidean space, or it may be a combination of both if it's a hybrid system. The second ingredient is going to be the set of initial states, and this is particularly interesting for control for computer science systems, where usually you have a very specific predefined set of states from which your system starts running. In control, normally X naught will be the whole X. In computer science, that's not always the case, and in control, also not always. But yeah, the third part will be the set of inputs. So what are the actions that you can inject into your system to modify how it behaves? The fourth one is essentially specifying the dynamics. It's a transition relation that is telling you from a given state X under a given action or input U, I will end up in some state X. And note that on purpose, I said there's this relation, this arrow is a relation. So it's a subset of these triples, meaning I'm allowing my systems to also be what we will call non-deterministic. So that from a given state X with a given input U, you may end up in a number of different states and you don't know anything about, there's no probability distribution or anything. It's just simply any of these things may happen. So you need to carry them with you when you're trying to synthesize things for safety. Or for reachability, to guarantee reachability or safety. Now, the fifth element is a set of outputs, and that's basically what represents what can you observe out of the behavior of your system. And what you can observe is basically determined by an output map, which is the sixth element that tells you how states are mapped into what you can observe, the outputs. Often I'll basically assume that Y and X are the same thing, and H is basically the identity map. And now you talk about the system being finite. So the typical models using computer science, if X is a finite countable set, and otherwise you say that it's an infinite system. So for instance, control systems will be infinite because Rn contains an infinite number of points. Let me move on. Now, let's see, what do we need to be able to construct in the problem that I was describing before of what will the control systems guy designing event trigger controllers will love to give to the real-time guy that needs to deal with the scheduling? Well, you would like to provide a model that captures exactly when events happen. So let me try to construct that following the modeling that I just described. So first, I have a control system. So therefore my state space X is going to be, my state set is going to be some Euclidean space Rn. And I said, well, normally in control, X naught is equal to X. So again, Rn. Now, what's more interesting is, let me define the dynamics. I'm going to assume that I don't have any inputs, because now my control system is a closed loop. So I don't have any inputs that I can touch. They are already decided for me. So all I can, my control system in closed loop, all I can observe is when I start from this point X, the next sample that I will see after tau seconds, it will be X prime. Now, so what I want to construct is basically some dynamics that will tell me, whoops, okay, that it will tell me from this current sample X, what will be the next sample that I will see? And that will be, I will place a transition in my transition relation from X to X prime, if and only if, and this is where, this is a bit of notation, my solution, the solution of my control system is starting from state X under time tau X, and I'll explain in a second what's tau X, ends up in X prime. Tau X will be the time that it takes my event trigger control loop to generate a violation of the triggering condition starting from X. Right? So this basically is capturing, if your last sample was X, the next sample that you will transmit is going to be X prime. And it's going to be X prime because that's where your system ends up by flowing tau X, which is the sampling time associated to the last sample X. Is this clear? Because this is the core of everything. This is essentially the core idea from which everything follows. Now, then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna say my output space of this system is gonna be intervals of the positive real numbers. And what are gonna be those, are gonna be real numbers. And my output map is basically gonna be the sampling time. So it's gonna tell me, this is your current sample X, the output associated to it is gonna be 3 seconds, meaning in 3 seconds, you're gonna have a violation of your event triggering condition, and that means that you're gonna have to transmit. And what you're gonna be transmitting after those 3 seconds is gonna be the X prime that you see because you have a transition from X to X prime, right? So this model is capturing exactly what are the dynamics of the sampling time. So what are the possible sequence, all the possible sequences of sampling times that such an event trigger control loop will be generating. And that's exactly the say first level abstraction that you could think of that would be useful for somebody that only cares about scheduling. If you only care about scheduling transmissions, you don't care of exactly what are the trajectories that your system are following. You only care about these sequences of times. That's all you care about. That's the only information you need. Now, what's the main challenge is that if you look at this system, I was saying, well, if the set of states is infinite, you have an infinite system. And the moment that you have an infinite system, and particularly one that looks as ugly as this one, first off, this is just an implicit formulation of the model, so it's really hard to play with it, to do any analysis, to do any synthesis at all. And let alone being able to do anything automatically or manipulating it algorithmically. But fortunately, now I can look at the second part of my PhD thesis. And what will be the trick? Well, let me try to construct something that captures the behavior of this system in some approximate way, but there is a finite object or close to being finite. So this is the solution that I came up with. The solution which will be answering or will be this missing part 3, how these network control systems and symbolic control methods can come together to solve a meaningful problem. And the idea is simply construct abstractions of that object that I just described so that they become finite objects in which now I can solve problems. Now, without getting into too many details, the main idea is that now what I will do is I'll partition the state space into a number of regions. And what I will do is I'll compute for each of those regions. I would like to compute what's the minimum sampling time associated to some point in it, and the maximum sampling time associated to some point in that region. So now what I will get is, if your current state is in this region, then you know that the next sampling time is going to be in this time interval. And then I can also construct, well, from a given region, you will only be able to land in some other set of regions because I know the time interval for which I will flow. And that's basically what we started constructing. Now, what is more interesting is that if you think about what that model actually is, you can show that it is semantically equivalent to a time automaton, which is the simplest hybrid system that people on computer science started studying, and where people started showing that while it's still a hybrid system, it's actually an infinite state system because you have some clocks. The state reachability problem is decidable, which means that you can actually construct automatic algorithms that can solve problems about reachability. And therefore, you can use those to solve problems of safety. You can even synthesize controllers for them, etc. Now, why I said that this is what I was trying to construct is equivalent to a time automaton is because imagine now that what I did is I partitioned my state space in 2 regions, and let me call them L1 and L2. Now, what I will have is an object that says, when you're in L1, a clock starts running, and this is C dot equals to 1, that's just a clock. And you can remain here until some maximum time tau upper bar. When your clock is showing you something between, and this should be tau under bar, between tau under bar and tau upper bar, you may go somewhere. And certainly when you hit tau upper bar, because your invariant here, you cannot remain anymore here, then you need to go to some other location. And that just basically means these transitions means there's a new transmission. So this, with a time automaton, I can capture these dynamics of having transmissions that need to happen between some, in some time interval, tau 1 under bar and tau 1 upper bar. And for this location 2, then the associated ones will be the tau 2s. By the way, I think there's some typos in this picture now that I see it. Anyway, what is important is that this model that I was trying to construct will be equivalent to a time automaton, and therefore I can follow essentially the plan that I was following with the abstractions of control systems. Now I can leverage all the work that people have been doing, again, for decades on time automata, the tools that exist there to solve interesting problems for event trigger control. Now, what we have been doing in the past 3-4 years is basically construct these objects and starting to solve interesting problems having these objects at hand. And to construct these abstractions, we follow 2 different approaches. One is what I kind of sketched is partition the state space, so divide your state space in regions, and then compute the time intervals associated to them. Now, I was fortunate enough to hire very smart PhD students, and basically the 2 PhD students working on this kind of came to the same idea somewhat independently, is that, well, why don't we flip also the argument? Why don't you partition the times, pick time intervals, and then compute the regions of the state space that are associated to those time intervals? And that raised basically 2 branches of things, how we could do things. The first one we have been already doing, even we had some initial work on it right before I submitted my ERC. The second one obviously was done during the period of my ERC. Now, you have some trade-offs here. So if you go through partitioning the state space, if you're in higher dimensional spaces, then you'll have a problem with the cost of dimensionality. If you do it the second way, you can somewhat tame the cost of dimensionality. But you can always combine both. There's multiple things that can be done there. I'm going to skip a little bit about this. I gave you a hand wave idea on what we do in this first approach. And this is basically how some of these objects look like. So we partition in cones for some mathematical reasons, and then you get time intervals depicted with how far these stars and circles are from the origin. And this is representing transitions from regions. So for instance, from region 5, you will, after your event, you will go to region 5 again, or to region 6, and so on and so forth. Now, the alternative approach is you pick time intervals and then you compute regions. And I drew them like concentric circles because of the technicalities, how we do things. They end up looking like this. In the benefit of time, I'm gonna skip a bit of these technicalities. What I wanted to show you is that in the process of solving this problem, again, we touch on yet another area of somewhat computer science related to verification, which is we combine optimization techniques. So we solve linear programs, and then we combine that with satisfiability modulo theory model checkers in what's called a counterexample guided iterative algorithm. So this is just to remark that while we are solving control/scheduling problems at the core of it, the techniques that we are using start diverging into optimization, model checking, theorem provers, you name it. And then the abstractions in this case look like some partitions of the state space of this form, which then to do efficient analysis, we subdivide, again, kind of combining with the other way of partitioning the state space into conic regions, into somewhat like non-uniform dartboards. And this is one of the examples that we created. Now, the final step is how do all these things come together? Well, the idea is then you have a time automaton representing one of the control loops, another time automaton representing the other control loop. We can enrich these ones with some actions, maybe allowing them to transmit before the event triggering time will arrive, so that they can avoid conflicts. And we model very simply the network. Just basically this model will say when two guys try to transmit at the same time, then, or within some time, then you have a collision. And now you have a controller that is trying to prevent that the network that is interacting with these two models hit this bad state. And how does it do that? Well, by forcing either this one or this other one to transmit a bit earlier at some points in time. Now, just an example. This is basically two control loops running event trigger being scheduled. And in this case, we did something slightly different. These are the decisions that come from the scheduler. It will take too long to show, but believe me, this is showing that there are no collisions. And you can see how the controller is actually, a sample and hold. Sometimes waits for longer. Sometimes it has more fast updates. And these are the two different controllers, the dash and the solid one. In order to do this, we use UP-Altiga, which is one of these tools that were developed in the early 2000s from the group of Kim Larsen in Aalborg. So you can see how, again, we are leveraging tools from time automata to solve problems that are related to control systems. Now, part of our project is to develop tools so that end users can simply say, hey, this is my event trigger controller, this is my other event trigger controller, is my network, construct for me a scheduler. And that's basically what we're doing. Initially, we started with MATLAB to construct the abstractions. Now we have ported everything to Python. We transform then the models, the abstractions that we construct, we transform them into time automata or networks of time automata, and then we use UPAL, different flavors of it, to construct strategies. And if you're interested, the software is being posted slowly on my website as we go testing and developing. And eventually we want to have even a network simulator that allows you to simulate everything. Now, I'm running out of time. Another extension that was mentioned on my ERC grant is to extend this to include also cost. And the idea to include cost is that suddenly now you can use tools of optimal scheduling using price time automata, so that you can also not only guarantee that there's going to be safety, that there are not going to be collisions, but that you can also guarantee a certain performance. So you can minimize the number of transmissions, or you can guarantee that you remain for as long as possible in one of the states, things of that sort. And that's something that you're allowed to do with tools like Upal Stratego. What are the challenges that we're encountering right now? One is that these models are somewhat conservative because they're looking at worst case scenarios. And the second main challenge is the scaling of scheduling with time automata. These tools do not scale very well once you pass 3 clocks. In our case, 3 clocks means 3 control loops. So what are we looking to solve these problems? One is to use periodic event trigger control, which transforms time automata into simple automata. You remove the hybrid part, you don't have clocks, you have basically discrete transitions that allows you to scale further. For the conservativeness, we're looking now into stochastic models, and now we'll have basically Markov chains as abstractions. We're looking into parallelization techniques and some more theoretical work on the area of time automata to tame the scheduling synthesis complexity. Now, I promised to show you one example of how event trigger control is a greedy approach, and if you do things smarter, you can get much more reductions on the transmission times. This is one such example. So here we have our model that is telling us from each point what is the event trigger time and where will we end up. So if we run from the same initial condition periodic event trigger controller, then you'll get these green lines, and the height means how close to the next transmission time they are. So the lower they are, the worse things are. And the yellow one is a smarter scheme that we construct by looking ahead a few sample times. So what happens here is, you see around here, we decide to transmit a little bit earlier. And by doing that, we avoid having this burst of communications, and we manage to keep our transmissions always rather high. So this is how now not only we solve scheduling, we can also use these things to do some sort of synthesis of transmissions or modify slightly our controllers so that we get even better performance. In summary, I showed you hopefully that there are many different approaches to operated control, what the scheduling problem is and why this is interesting, how symbolic approaches can help you solve some of these problems, how time automata becomes relevant in this case, and some new approaches to analyze design control systems traffic. As said, we are looking into enriching abstractions with cost in what's called price time game automata, traffic models for stochastics, the strategies that I mentioned before for scheduling synthesis. And of course, we're working on demonstrations on actual systems, which we are doing in collaboration with people in Trento, with Gianpietro, Amy, and their team. And quite recently, we're looking into also generating some sort of simulators to check also in simulations of real network simulation, how things work out. Finally, I promised to give you some tips and tricks. Maybe I address some of the questions, then the people that need to leave can leave, and the students that are interested on these tips and tricks stay. Does that make sense, Giovanni?
I can stay 5 more minutes. Yes, but
okay. So somebody was asking if I consider using optimization modulo theory instead of the loop SMT LP solve. No, I will have to check with my students because they looked into multiple different approaches. And in that loop that I was showing, I went very quickly over it. I'm not sure if, I'm not sure. That's a very good tip. I will need to look into that. I'm not really really sure if that will solve it, if that could solve our problem. But that's something certainly interesting to look into. Now, while people decide to ask other questions, let me go into this different tips and tricks. It's only 3 slides. The first one, I like to call it use all your ammunition. In that sense, I think at least for ERC grants, what's important is to show that you are the one. So you are the right person to solve this problem. In my case, what I did is to leverage that, hey, I have a telecommunications background, I have a controls PhD, and I've done a lot of work related to theoretical computer science, or this interface between control and computer science. This project requires those 3 areas. Therefore, there's not really so many people with that combination of backgrounds, and in particular, not so many people that have been doing, I wanted to say top level research in both event trigger control and formal methods for control. So that's probably one of the most important tips. Try to figure out what's your ammunition and how you can bring it forward to show that you're the right person to solve this problem. The second one is seek ideas for problems in an area where people will recognize you. So you can always decide to switch completely, but it's a bit harder to convince people that you can solve the problem that you're posing if you're saying, well, now suddenly I'm gonna be looking into synthetic biology. I'm exaggerating, but you want to be a recognizable name on the topic, because experts on the topic that you're proposing your problem are gonna be the ones revising your proposal. The third one, this is kind of obvious, try to think outside the box. So certainly for ERCs, what's not appreciated, or what it's rarely granted with very exceptional cases, is ideas that just follow on the beaten path. So you want to combine ideas, kind of like what I showed you, combining very different things, bringing ideas from a somewhat distant field to the problem where you have been working. Think a little bit outside the standard way of thinking. Show that you're independent, so that you can do work without your PhD supervisors or postdoc supervisors. And if possible, show that you can already lead, so that you have been supervising master students, PhDs, because that gives a sense of confidence that you can indeed carry out such a research project. The next one is arguably as important, if not even more important than the previous one. The previous one is almost for granted, like, you look for interesting novel ideas. The second one is the one where a lot of people seem to fail, or that I've, at least colleagues that I've seen. One is be your worst critic. And that I equated to start early. If the deadline for the ERC is actually, I think today, for the starting grant, if you started a month ago, you're already way too late. If you started 6 months ago, you're already late. I will say you need to start a year beforehand, if not even earlier. In my case, I think from the moment that I started thinking about this until the moment that I submitted, it elapsed several years, like 3 years at least, because you want to have a well-defined idea where it holds water. There's no crack through which people can attack your idea, saying like you're solving something that doesn't make sense, or you're solving something that it's trivial to be solved in this way or this other way. You want to be informed and know that your idea is solid in that sense. Next, you need to assess if you're at the right point of your career. In theory, the ERC starting grant, for instance, is like from, I think, 2 years after your PhD. Look at the statistics on how early people get their starting grant. I was too late in applying. I applied really on my last chance. But starting too early will put you in a position of competing with people that have already 5-6 years of experience, and you're not going to look very competitive. Consult colleagues. So don't be afraid of sharing your idea with colleagues that, of course, seek people that you trust, that they're not going to steal your ideas, but get as much feedback as possible, because what you may miss is precisely what a good reviewer will actually find as a weak point of your proposal. And that implies also consulting non-experts. So your partners, parents, grandparents, friends that work in sociology, you name it. Like people I got actually some of the uh, hardest criticisms from people that have no technical background whatsoever, but they just read popular science sometimes, and they say like, yeah, but why do you care about this when I've heard that, you know, I don't know, blockchain dot 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 or whatever other things. So you want to hear as many diverse points of view as possible to make sure that you have something solidly tied. And the last one is to think as a reviewer. So you want to answer at least these three main questions, like why you, why this problem, is it more of the same that people have been doing? And the last thing is not a question, but is something as a reviewer myself, make it easy to find information. I'm reviewing proposals, and while I'm reviewing the proposal, my kids show up, or a student calls me, or an email comes with something urgent. I get distracted, I come back, and I need to catch myself back into where was I? What was this idea about? So try from time to time in your proposals to uh, add little boxes with summaries of, you've read this paragraph, but in essence, this is what I just told you. So you set anchors in your proposal so that somebody that is reviewing it can come back and very quickly catch up. And even by only reading these boxes, get a very quick glimpse and summary of what the whole idea is about. With all this said, I would like to thank you all for your attention, including the extra minutes that I took. And of course, acknowledge the work, especially of the students that appear on the pictures here. Arman Sherifi, which was a master's student with whom I started doing some of this work. Vicky Esquilla, a postdoc with whom I first implemented some of the scheduling. Anchifu, Janis, and Gabriel, which have been PhD students working on these topics. But of course, a bunch of other master students, PhDs, postdocs, and collaborators, as I mentioned already, Gianpietro and Amy, and Matteo, and other PhDs and postdocs also in Trento that have collaborated, contributed in one way or another to this project. This is all I had to tell you. If you have any questions, I'm glad to address them, and I have enough time. So if you need to leave, but I can stay a bit longer and answer questions.
Great, thanks a lot, Manuel. It was a very nice and inspiring talk. I would ask especially the juniors, PhDs and postdocs, if they have questions about these tips, especially, but also on the technical side. Maybe in the meantime, I wanted to ask you something. So how far is this research from being applied to industry? Are you in touch with some companies or?
That's hard to say. No, we are during on the ERCs in particular. There's no requirements to have companies. It's actually more expected. There is more open blue skies. I think they call it blue sky research. So I think it will take quite a bit. My hope is that we're still checking which of these approaches have more promising applications. We're also collaborating, as I said, with GP and Amy, and implementing and trying to show on close to real applications the potential benefits. And the plan is that through other projects more focused on applications, try to start making this available to industry. And that's why one of the reasons why we want to construct a solid toolbox is to make it more accessible, because still, I try to keep it today as simple as possible in terms of the mathematics. And even then, at least I perceive it as sometimes it gets a bit too abstract. So you want to have something where, like, an end user, all he needs or she needs to care about is, this is my control system, I design it this way, give me a triggering condition, give me a way of reducing the amount of communications, or these are my 3 control loops, this is my the rate at which my communication channel can transmit, what can you do? So that's where we're going. So if you ask me if I will have to guess, I will say, knowing my little interactions with industry, I will say a decade, maybe. Yeah, it still will take some time.
Well,
I think something may be earlier, but the grand scheme, it will take a long time. And that's a bit also, as a matter of fact, a bit kind of on an ERC, you don't need to put any emphasis on that, on being immediately applicable to industry. I will say that actually, if anything, that may even hurt you in the review process, because things that are so close to application, yeah, they will not be seen as very fundamental. Like, that's, if it's so close to application, to tier, whatever is called application tier, then it's not fundamental research, it's something else. There's an exception. There's a panel 6, I think it is, which is a bit closer to applications somewhat, but that's a bit of a I think it's a trickier panel.
You were applying to P7, right? Or
yeah, this was P7. That's in particular for ERCs. You need to pick carefully the panel, depending on the topic. And certainly what I've heard, and I've seen the statistics, unless you have a very strong reason, you don't want to apply across panels, because your chance of success then drops to half, basically, of the already low chances of success.
Right. Is there any other question from the audience? Don't be shy.
If you're shy, you can always also shoot me an email. I think I'm fine. I'm easy to be found on the internet. So if after seeing, do you want me to send you the slides, or?
If you can send the slides, it would be good. The other thing that we are currently planning to make the videos that have been recorded public available through the Unitian YouTube channel, so that people could have a look at them offline.
That's fine. I'll send you the slides to both of you, Giovanni and Marco.
Thanks.
Thanks.
And then there's, I think my contact is on the first slide. I'm not 100% sure, but otherwise, if anybody has questions, feel free to ask me. And as I already did, I think with Giovanni, if you plan to apply for an ERC and you want some input, I'm glad to help up to my contact is not there. I'm glad to help up to my availability in terms of time.
That would be great.
So,
okay, very good. And I think unless there are some last minute questions, we can conclude the meeting here. I don't know if Manuel was saying that you could stay.
I can stay a bit longer in case somebody is feeling shy or still thinking about possible questions. I can stay another 5 minutes or so.
Okay. Otherwise, we just call it a day. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Manuel and Marco, and we will maybe get in touch via email if you want to discuss a bit about the DOMT possibility, optimization module tier.
Oh yeah, that would be interesting. I'll have to think. I will probably need to look. I'll ask one of my students to look a bit onto it, and then I'll ask you because so this was from you because I only saw that it was from the host. So I guess you have the experience with it.
Yeah, I have some experience in satisfiability modular theory and optimization modular theory.
Okay, then I can send you maybe a paper where we describe exactly how we are using this and for which purpose. Essentially, we're using this to approximate nonlinear dynamics by linear dynamics. And this is something, there's several papers. So if you look for, they call it polyflows. So it's related to Carleman approximations.
We'll definitely be interested as well for other applications. So if you can send me the paper, so we'll definitely have a look at it.
I'll send you a couple of papers about it because we are actually also working with a master's student on constructing some tool, and this OMT may actually indeed become very relevant then. So
and another thing, so if you rely on a model checker based on satisfiability modular theory, instead maybe of building one on yourself, you may rely on something that is already existing.
Yeah,
so
that's what we do. We actually use either C3 or dreal. Those are the two that we're using mostly.
Okay.
Yeah, because constructing your own from scratch, you're never gonna compete. C3 is, I think, the state of the art, and dreal, once you admit this satisfiability up to the delta.
Yeah, indeed. So that's a problem. With D3, so you need to reason about this approximation with respect to this delta. While there is this IC3, or that it's an open source version based on Matzat. I'm not sure whether it's the one you are referring to.
We use, so dreal is one. Dreal is from Carnegie Mellon.
Yeah, dreal is from Carnegie Mellon.
And Z3 is the one from Microsoft, I think.
Oh, Z3. Okay.
Yeah, Z3. Yeah.
Okay.
Those are the two that we have been linking to in our tools because they're I think both are open source.
Yeah, and there is another one that is called IC3, which is exactly a model checker oriented to verify safety and LTL properties. That that could be something to look at if you are interested.
Yeah, so I mean, we normally look into temporal logics. In this particular problem, we didn't need to. This is just basically to check inequalities of polynomials.
Or non-polynomials. In that sense, then Z3, I think, is the right one. But even Z3 has the possibility to perform optimization internally without relying on an external LP solver.
Okay, that would be interesting. So I'll send you a paper where we describe exactly where we're using this Seki's loop with the LP solver, and I'll try to highlight exactly which part. Hopefully is readable enough. And then I'll talk to my students to see maybe we can schedule some meeting and see, because we are trying to use this also for constructing a reachability analysis tool for nonlinear systems. So it's something where it will certainly become useful.
Okay.
Very nice tip.
And we also did some work. I mean, just mentioning on satisfiability for the nonlinear system. So extending SMT to handling nonlinear system, and we are integrating also into an optimization modular theory framework. So if there are some benchmarks on this, so definitely could be something also to look at.
Yeah. No, very, very nice. I will certainly take your offer and contact you again. So
okay.
It seems that I'm gonna have a lot of connections with Trento. Maybe I need to get a part-time position there. No.
Okay. So thanks again on my side. Now I need to go in the other meeting.
Yeah, I'm also leaving. Thank you again, also from my side, Manuel. It was very nice. hearing about your research.
No, we will be in touch.
Sure thing.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay.
See you
Bye.
guys.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.